Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fawcett. Each week we interview experts in AI, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is the August edition of AI Pulse. You probably guessed that because, as you'll notice, my co-host for the Pulse shows, Tom Pringle, is on the screen as well. And Tom's director of pilot research. And we're going to, take a look at all the news that happened over the past month since our July show. And so anyway, welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to be here as always. And, it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier. While the news maybe has slowed down a little over the summer, there's still plenty to talk about, I think.
Yeah, it is August, and as we know, that's that's vacation month for Europe, and and a lot of.
What are you suggesting?
Well, I'm just suggesting that you guys have a bit more balance in your work life than perhaps people on my side of the ocean. So
carefully and diplomatic. Well done.
Was that good? I thought it was pretty good. Really, yeah, but yeah, no, it has been a little bit slow, but there are a few things that tie back to some of the stuff we talked about in the last episode. And then there's some other things that came up that during the month that I thought were really interesting. So I don't know. Why don't we just jump in?
Sure.
You'll remember last time, Tom, we talked about small models. Well, I don't know if you saw this, but OpenAI released a small model on the ChatGPT 4.0 framework, but it's 4.0 mini. Have you taken a look at that at all?
I haven't had time to look at the detail of it, but 100% it follows directly onto the conversation we kind of started last time around, which is, I do think there's going to be this divergence of these mega models and then these smaller, more specific models. And although this is not exactly that, by the way, do you like the new watch?
Oh, yeah. Very nice. Very nice.
It's good, isn't it?
Does it have AI built in?
You know what? No, it doesn't. But it has a picture of a donut on it because it's a Simpsons watch. It's a birthday.
Well, that's almost as good as AI. So, okay, I'll give you that.
It's definitely not a smart watch, but it is a smart watch, if you see what I mean. Although this is not exactly the same as what we were talking about last time, I think it also chimes quite closely in with the conversation we had about Apple Intelligence running more models locally. For lots of different reasons, not just because, of course, they can be very expensive to run in time, energy, and cost. But I think it is kind of the way the wind is blowing, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, no, you're right. And the performance on this is really good, which you'd expect on a smaller model. But it also apparently is quite functional, and a lot of companies are going that direction, because of the fact it does cost less, it is faster, it takes up less, resources. And I think you're going to, like we said last time, but I do think this is going to get to be a very common theme where you hear, people running local models and smaller models and mid-sized models and vertically trained model. All these different specialties as they try to, do different things with the Gen AI piece. So
absolutely. Go on. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, but it was interesting. I thought when they brought it out, and like I said, most of the reports that I've gotten from different people and just playing around with it myself a little bit, it's actually quite functional, and I like the zippiness in it, the response. Right, you get a quick response. It may not be a right response, but it's fast.
That reminds me of a quote from The Simpsons, talking with The Simpsons earlier. Do you want it done right or do you want it done fast?
That could very well be the case. I don't know. Anyway, I don't know.
Oh boy!
So one thing that I go ahead.
All I was going to say was I was pure curiosity on my part, and I apologize because I am just back from vacation. This is about as tanned as I get. Normally I kind of get a bit red, to be honest. But some protection is important. But I'm curious, just talking about that context and verticals and industries and stuff like that. Do you know if the mini model can be augmented, the RAG augmentation? Can you kind of train it or have RAG on top of it that allows you to kind of bring it to more specificity? That's a hard word to say. To your particular circumstances.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I've seen a lot of around the platforms and around some of the enterprise vendors and the way they're kind of trying to put this in play. Because obviously you have to be really concerned with company data, and most of us aren't really into the idea of training a large language model on our personal data, our company data, right? I mean, customer data, all those different things that are protected, particularly where you sit, but also. Even in the U.S., there in California, a few other places, there are regulations around it. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. It's interesting too to see like how because like Salesforce is a good example, right? Because they built RAG into the whole system around the trust system, and they have vector database that allows the company data to be protected, and then they have this zero residency idea, so the data is not held anywhere else, and it's also filtered in and out as you go in and out of the language model, so there's no personally identifiable information, PII, passed, so you're not training the model on any of your data. So I think that is actually part of what you're going to see from a different view there. And there's also some new ways that I saw this month of implementing RAG that I think is very, very interesting. It's called Ensemble RAG, and Salesforce is what brought that up to me, and I ended up doing a little research and writing about it. But basically, it's a RAG system that uses more than one type of technology in the process, right? So it's semantic search, vector databases, all these different sort of technologies that can converge to make the grounding of the model more effective, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And should we remind the audience should we remind the audience what RAG stands for?
We probably should do that. Yeah, retrieval augmented generation. So the idea that you provide the model more context. That's as simple as it gets, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. I heard it a couple of times. Sometime, I said, hang on a second, what does this mean? I had that embarrassing moment where I had to Google it.
Well, and unfortunately, one of my shows recently, I asked a question about, it was an unplanned question in the middle. I was like, oh, are you guys using, and I had to go back and explain it because it wasn't really very fair to my guest that I hit him with RAG and he didn't actually know what it was, and but anyway, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, it's
no, of course, and that's just it. I mean, kind of classic in the business world. We all sit around tables or virtual tables these days, meeting, and sometimes it was hilarious. There was a company that you and I both worked at, and one time I was in a meeting. You weren't in this one, and someone used this acronym. I'm like, I just put my hand up and said, "I'm sorry, I don't actually know what that means." And they knew what it meant, but they didn't know what it stood for. As a business industry, we keep on chucking those around.
There's so many acronyms, and I've had the issue too, like at IDC, I would have this when you go across the different practices. You go into a hardware world or a services world, very different than the software world, but obviously as software people, that we don't want to think about that. But somebody would use an acronym and I'd be like, that didn't make sense, but it was because it stood for something completely different than what I knew. So it is a thing, right? Yeah.
A thing for sure.
Wait, you know what, while we're on OpenAI though, I wanted to mention this, and I don't even really know what to make of this, but I'm sure you saw that there's been quite the leaping from the ship sort of effect over the last month or so from OpenAI with the executives. I mean, they've had three, key figures and then some other high profile hires and that sort of thing that have left for whatever reason, different reasons, I guess. But there's been some noise around that. Like, is there a problem? What's going on? And I guess that's normal anytime you see, a number of people leave. But.
Yeah, for sure. And look, obviously I do not know. You can sort of argue that this is that point, in a company's journey where they're kind of moving from startup to being a bigger business, and that implies a great deal of change. And some people, kind of love being part of that. Others don't necessarily want to do that. I also know there's plenty of people who are in startups who are kind of somewhat addicted to the startup world. Yeah, exactly right. And the minute it gets a bit less startup, they're off to another startup. So maybe that, who can honestly know the truth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, right? I think you're right on the scale up part, right? Once you get to a certain point, some people are maybe not as happy with the situation, or they aren't even really a great fit anymore for whatever you're doing. And you think about OpenAI, I mean, they started out in one direction, and then, once the release of ChatGPT and the push towards growing a business and all the money it takes to run the business, and there's even there was some rumor around cost and how much the cost had gone up and was really hurting OpenAI. When would they get profitable? Will they get profitable? Because it just costs so much to operate. So some of that, I'm sure, is the nature of the business. But I did notice that there were a few defections to Anthropic. One particularly, one of the co-founders, John Schulman, went to Anthropic, and I think there's almost a little difference in the thought process around how the culture at the company works, right? I mean, Anthropic has held more to some of the ideals that OpenAI had maybe than OpenAI has over time. So maybe some of that was just trying to get back to kind of what they thought originally, and what their passion was originally.
Yeah, totally possible. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the cost, because we touched on that last time around as well. I think increasingly since kind of June, July, we were talking about it first. There's been a little bit more show me the money in terms of AI. And that's a good thing, by the way, in my opinion. But also, I think, kind of the spiraling costs. We talked about the cost of trading, and there was a couple of wonderful quotes that you shared. Was it up to $1 billion in future, something like that?
Yeah, it was. It had bees in there, I know for sure.
It was a big number by anyone's reckoning.
Yeah.
So I just think, look, there's going to be that change, and it goes from kind of is this, and I'm not talking specifically about OpenAI here, but I think there's that point at which some things move from being kind of a science to being business-backed, money-backed, capital-backed, and therefore has to start making a return in a way in which is not always a comfortable transition.
Well, and I mean, the the way we've approached startups in tech, particularly during the crazy times of the last 10 years or so, when interest rates were so low, money was very free flowing, and so it's easy to just run out and spend to get as much market share as you can, to get as much product in the market, to make as many acquisitions as you can. I mean, all these different things, right? And you aren't necessarily worried as much about profitability in that stage. But we've grown up quite a lot, and with the interest rates where they are, money's not as available. There's a big push to make your business viable, profitable, or at least have some sort of a chart that shows me how you could be profitable at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll know better than I, because one of the metrics that people use is the kind of the cost to buy $1 of revenue. And kind of how I would be very curious.
And when it costs more to buy the dollar than the dollar.
And what's the long-term potential of that dollar?
Always, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Yep. Well, I mean, it is interesting, and I don't know. We'll keep an eye on it, obviously, and report back next month if if it continues, or if there's some more feedback from that. But I just wanted to bring it up because I do think it's a relevant topic to see what kind of pressure is being put on them and kind of where it's going, and also Musk legal battle, as he's certainly been pushing harder against them and from this lawsuit and from his competition, and apparently he's reallocating a lot of resources internally from one startup to another, and spending more on Grok, I guess, than the others. So I'm sure that's some additional pressure as well. So
well, it's a market that is developing rapidly, and I think that's an understatement. Talking of recent market developments, though, hang on a second, and change. 1st of August, the EU AI Act became a thing following its kind of transition through the parliamentary system.
Yeah, that took a while for it to finally be enforced, but it is.
Well, indeed, and there's an enforcement. My understanding, and just general disclaimer at this point, I am not a lawyer or a legal expert in these matters. But my understanding is that sort of different parts of it are going to be kind of a gradual enforcement from that 1st of August date. Yeah. But I am very curious, because you kind of alluded to this earlier in our conversation, that things over on this side of the Atlantic tend to have a different regulatory framework to those on that side. So what is the review on the AI Act in the US? Is it? Well, you tell me.
Well, I mean, no, I think it's interesting, and I mean, I take a little different approach and looked at this than perhaps some of my my colleagues here, but I do think we need, and even the executive order that Biden put out last year is significant in a lot of ways, and we're seeing it play out, maybe perhaps even more significant. Although, of course, we have an election and perhaps a change of definitely a change of the guard, but perhaps a dramatic change of the guard. I guess we'll see. And so, will that continue? How will that be approached here? But there's some things in that act, and I have actually spent a decent amount of time going through it, because I was really curious about how do you start to restrict this, right? Because there's so many, you can't just say, I'm going to write a way to govern AI. Like, okay, no. How do you approach that, right? Because you've got everything from natural language processing to generative AI, and they're very different, right? Machine learning and algorithms, and there's all these things. But the one thing they did that I really liked is this idea of risk-based classification. The idea that we're gonna assess the risk and regulate systems according to the level of risk. So if they're minimal risks, then it's like a consumer application. It's mostly exempt regulations. And then if it's limited, then it has a little more, like a chatbot perhaps. So there's some transparency obligation. Make sure that you're revealing that it's a chatbot, that kind of thing, but not a lot. But then when you get to high risk, it says based on their risk to fundamental rights, safety. High-risk AI systems can be used in infrastructure, education, employment, essential public and private services, law enforcement, and migration. So things that have the potential to have a dramatically negative effect on the population in one way or another, they get regulated much more closely, and they have to prove that they there's governance, there's documentation, there's record keeping, there's transparency, there's human oversight. I mean, all these things, and it has some teeth eventually. I mean, obviously, it takes a while for that to come in, but so I mean, for me, that seems like a pretty good approach. And they're also doing some startup support, which I was really into this idea of fostering innovation, and at the same time providing a regulatory sandbox so you can actually, build the application and go through the process interactively with the regulatory authority in a controlled environment to actually get through. So I don't know. I think they did a good job in general. I mean, it took a couple of years to get it through the system, but I feel like it's a good framework, and I hope that we here on this side of the ocean decide that we can take a look at that and get something in place, because I do think it's absolutely important to have something in place, particularly in my mind around risk and transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it in terms of how I interpret it, which is you could have started this from two different angles, and I think they took the right approach. You could take it from the technology angle and try to regulate individual technologies. But as we all know, there's lots of different technologies and it changes all the time. And that AI label applies across a very broad spectrum. Or you can look at the kind of the principles. And I think, kind of, as you say, it's the risk, right? So what is the risk of harm or impact or damage? And, I like to talk about the scale of that as well, right? So, for example, if it affects an individual, that's, one scale. If it affects an entire population, that's another scale. So I think, that kind of approach is very sensible. And it's going to take a while for things to work through. There's going to be the new AI office. There's a supervisory scientific kind of body as well. But, just like the GDPR regulations, it's now I'm going to get this wrong. Hopefully I'm going to get it right. So I want to say it's extraterrestrial. That's definitely wrong. It's extraterrestrial.
That's not it. That's the one. That's the one. Although I like the idea that it's extraterrestrial.
Well, that would make it kind of cool. But like the GDPR. So if you are a business that is expanding into a European territory, or you are processing data of European people, then you're going to be subject to this. And the fines, you use the word teeth, are they very big teeth? Because I think it was, what was the fine? Was 40 million or 7% of worldwide revenue.
Yeah, it was not a paltry sum, I guess is the way to put that.
Yeah, I mean, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but it was about that, and it struck me as being significant.
Yeah, I think it is, and so I mean, we'll see how this works. And GDPR certainly set some standard for privacy that we've mirrored in a few places here, like California's law, for example. But we haven't done a national one, and with some of the challenges around governing in a very partisan environment, we've had little chance of getting some regulation on privacy in place, and probably the same thing's true with AI, at least for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, we've got executive order in place. If that stays in place, and then we'll have states that will put laws in place around that. California is already moving in that direction. So I think that at least will somewhat mirror this. I don't know if they'll take exactly the same approach, but I do think the risk-based approach is quite useful and really a good way to think about the technology versus going from the back end to the front, right? Machine learning, how do I regulate that? Well, it depends on what you're using it for, right? That's as simple as it is. So.
Right, precisely.
Speaking of using things in a unique way, Tom, too, I wanted to bring this up because I wrote an article about this not long ago, but it was, I'll tell you, there's a little story behind it. I was reading an article about Taco Bell's new automatic order taking system, AOT. And of course, the news here has been, was all focused around McDonald's decision to drop their automated ordering taking system. But it's a little more complicated than that. It wasn't just like, oh, we're just not going to do that. This was a pilot. We did it for a period of time working with IBM as a partner. And actually, it was even more complex than that, because there was a startup that McDonald's had funded that then IBM took over. And so it was complicated. But I was reading this article about the Taco Bell announcement and how they were going forward with their AOT they've been working on for a couple of years. And the comments really made me think of the idea that, for a lot of people, they don't have a lot of sophistication around the knowledge of what AI is. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean that there's so much noise, and especially a lot of noise created around generative AI, that people just sort of assume that AI is AI. And as you and I know, that's not true. It depends on what you're trying to do and what technologies you're using. And one of the comments that really got me was some guy talking about, I don't want to go into Taco Bell and place an order and the machine hallucinates and gives me something completely different. And that would be a comment about generative AI, I suppose, although we're certainly getting better at grounding and other things like we talked about already. But the truth of the matter is that's a generative AI fault. And neither one of these systems have generative AI anywhere in them. So there's no risk. If anybody wants to know, no risk of hallucination in the Taco Bell space. If you order a taco, you're going to get a taco.
That's very reassuring.
Unless the human screws up, right? No, I know you were concerned. And I mean, unless, of course, the human does.
To be fair, I've been through the drive-through and not always necessarily got exactly what I thought I was ordering.
That's fair.
It's interesting. So all this natural language processing technology there has been around for decades, right? Decades. You're just right. I mean, your podcast here is Disambiguation. I mean, it really nailed it, because we talk about some of these capabilities like they're brand new, like they're something. I remember when I started my career in industry analysis, talking about sentiment analysis for call centers and stuff like that, right? And that was considered, even then, I mean, it was relatively new, but we're still talking about kind of a lot of the same underpinnings of what we're talking about with these ordering systems here. What the Taco Bell or the McDonald's system would make of my accident, I would be very curious to find out.
Well, that would be an interesting one to test, right? Because I have tried several things, and I mean, my origination in the U.S. is from the South, although I've certainly neutralized my accent a fair bit. But even so, I've seen the systems have a problem with me. Well, then from my mom, who is a Southern grandma, she's not neutralized her accent, and I can tell you, I've tried to set up dictation systems for her so she can just talk to a system, and it does not understand her at all. So I hope she doesn't try to do that at Taco Bell, because who knows what she'll get. But I do think it's an interesting thing. But my point here, though, as I was looking at it, once I went through the details, though, what I found was that it was a very different approach. Taco Bell approached the project differently. McDonald's was doing a pilot. They tested it. It didn't live up to what they wanted. They went back to the drawing board. They are saying they're not going to ever do this. They're just going back. Taco Bell did a very structured project to test all the component parts and roll it out in a controlled way to prove out everything they were doing. They did it as the project, like any IT project. If you were giving them advice, you would have told them to do it this way, right? I mean, they approached it in a very intentional way, and the system seems to be quite well proven out. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not going to ever mess up, because I mean, if you use any NLP system, you've had some accent issues depending on who did what to the system and when, right?
Yeah, for sure. I said, talking of Taco Bell, remember that movie Demolition Man?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think Taco Bell was the only restaurant that survived the restaurant wars. He was invited by the actor's Nigel Hawthorne, I think, one of my favorites. He invited Taco Bell, which was very confusing for the Stallone character in the moment.
Well, I mean, Taco Bell can be a little confusing, but hey, it's a good one. It's a good typical American fast food restaurant. I'll say that.
Yeah.
I read something the other day, shifting gears, but I was just thinking about this because I'm still a little bit surprised by this. Maybe I shouldn't be, just considering the state of the VC market and funding, capital markets, all those things. But in calendar Q1 of this year, there were 59 private equity takeover buyouts in the tech world of startups. 59 in Q1, and I don't know what Q2 looked like, but I know it was on track to beat that. There seems to be a real push among private equity at this point. Maybe it's just because they're getting good deals. Maybe those startups are not getting their money in time, and so they're running out of runway. I'm not sure, but I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, is it another one of those cycles, or is there something underneath this that's driving that?
It's a great question. I'm gonna plead ignorance, because I don't think there's enough data to tell us, which this is a trend or whatever yet. I mean, tell me. Let's start with what you think on it, because I mean, it has been. We've seen more private equity acquisition, for sure. Is that a comment about the fact there's loads of private equity looking for a home? I don't know. Or is it a comment about venture capital and nature of that changing, perhaps? And we touched on this in the past. We touched on the high concept that the kind of traditional SaaS model, if you will, is definitely evolving. That would obviously imply that the kind of the capital that supports it is going to change as well to some degree.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think there's several things that have happened that kind of converged. I mean, we had the interest rate changes in the U.S., which certainly changed the availability of VC venture capital funding, and slowed down that funding quite a bit. So there's just less money being spent right now on startups. And then at the same time, you had a lot of money that flowed into private equity. So they had a lot of money, and they didn't really have that many places to put it. So they started looking at this, and obviously so much hype and noise and excitement around AI, it just seems like a logical place to start to do some roll-ups. Because, the other thing, and I was listening to somebody talk about this the other day, and I've been in several startups too. Startups, we've always thought in software, if we go at this by carving out a really tiny niche, building out that functionality, getting that into a customer, and then start to build things out around it, that eventually you get to a point where you can, have a sustainable business. Well, come to find out, I mean, especially in a world where the capital's tough and it's hard to sell stuff and, all these other issues, that's a hard way to go if you don't have everything built out, because what we've done is just created, a bunch of little point solutions, and that's what businesses are buying. And when you try to figure out how to do that systematically with AI and process, you've got a serious problem because your data is all fragmented into a bunch of different little systems. So I suspect there's something in the model itself that perhaps isn't holding up in the new environment.
Yeah. And, you use the term there, the roll-ups, and I do think, some of those private equity businesses would be well positioned to help do that and build out some of those kind of bigger capabilities that are complementary. Naturally, you buy just random example, you buy 3 companies, you will have some overlapping customers, but you'll have some that are sort of genuinely greenfield and new opportunities and, under the same roof, under the same strategic direction, have additional opportunity.
Yes. Well, and we've done, to be fair, we've grown and used acquisitions. The vendors have used acquisitions to grow and add functionality and features that they want to build out themselves. And certainly private equity, when it has money and looking to put it somewhere, rolling up and buying solutions that are adjacent and stitching them together can be, quite a good move and build out a company that, could be much more competitive because it does have a complete solution. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me, but I did think the number was much higher than what I thought was happening when I read that. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see. The next lot of data will be very telling. But you really surprised me there, because we were talking about automated order taking. I thought you were going to go for the voice interaction with OpenAI and Google. I would have paid serious money on you getting in that direction.
I know. I like to throw you a curveball once in a while and kind of go in a different direction.
I like that.
No, that's well, and I think that I like the conversational one. I think is a really relevant conversation that we should have, no pun intended, because of the fact that we have seen growing more and more conversational AI, right? And OpenAI rolled out a ChatGPT version, or at least I think it's partially rolled out at this point, that is voice activated, and Google Gemini announced that yesterday, I think, or maybe it was the day before, live voice interfaces. So how I thought about this in general, that part of generative AI is really changing the interface to a conversational natural language interface with the systems. So it doesn't surprise me to see it going in this direction, but I guess it is a little bit. It's interesting to see both competitors within a week of each other, announce the new features.
Yeah, I suppose I think back to my fondness for science fiction, a fondness that I know you share. And I think, what is the natural way to interact with a machine, a capability? It's to use our voices. We don't, and it's still surprising. Maybe this is terrible to say. I don't know. Tell me if I'm miles off base here. I'm kind of disappointed it hasn't come sooner. I kind of, when the first fuss about generative AI kicked off, and it was like, have a conversation with a solution, I'm thinking, great, I'm going to switch the mic on and say, put this appointment in my diary for then, and do this and that, and then check my flights and check I've got my frequent flyer number in, stuff like that. But no, I have to type it all out. What the heck?
Yeah.
Is that lazy?
Well, that's a fair point, Tom. And you're right. It has been that there's some places where it's moved quickly, right? Because we were already in the chatbot world. So once we added generative AI, we just built smarter chatbots, and they chat because that's what that's the name, right? So, I think that part, moved pretty quickly, and the capabilities were there. But it's interesting that in the base kind of interaction, the chat interaction was text and not voice. And now it's kind of moving in that direction more and more for those general models as well. And I think, that is an indication of what's to come in the enterprise. I always go back to my Star Trek example of Scotty, trying to talk to the dumb computer that he visits when they go back in time to Earth, and he's very frustrated by it. I love that because I think that's
he's talking into the mouse, isn't he? He starts talking to the mouse.
Yep. One of my favorite scenes ever. It's like computer. Anyway, yeah, I think it's so. I mean, fair point. It is a long time coming, and it is something that I think is pretty exciting if the rollout goes well and if it works as intended, to which it seems to, and if it can recognize your and my accent, that is a fairly diverse system, I think. So
I will be very impressed. Number one. Number two, it kind of begs the obvious question. By the way, I'm still giggling over the Star Trek reference. That's brilliant. I'd forgotten that scene. What was he? It's the formula for transparent aluminium, isn't it, or something like that? And he
something like that.
Yeah, it's something like that, because they have to ship the whales in a Klingon bird of prey. Not that I'm showing off I like science fiction or anything.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, we're science fiction nerds. I don't know what else to say.
I've just gone way off track. Sorry, everyone. But it's really interesting to me that the way that we interact with technology, there's kind of a couple of things. It should just be the way that you want it, right? That it should be a natural way. So some people, that's going to be typing, some people will be speaking. Gestures are becoming more of a thing that we've seen as well now, sort of on the watches, and no doubt, will come more to our screens and augmented reality and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really interesting. It kind of crashes into another big trend, which is the remote working, work from home versus the office. Because what people used to say 10, 20 years ago is, no one's going to be in this big open plan office talking to their computer all the time. It's going to have this like massive noise and not get anything done. Whereas now, if I'm not in a meeting, I could very happily sit in my wee office here and talk to the computer. That'd be perfectly reasonable. It beats talking to myself, which I find myself doing sometimes.
It is an interesting one, although there was some underlying commentary around the fact that there's some worry in the social science world that people are going to become too dependent on their AI friends and eschew actual relationships with humans, because it's just easier to have a conversation with the AI, right?
Yeah, that's been. I'm afraid we're right back in science fiction turf territory again, rather, which is I forgot which book it was that I read. It may have been one of the Red Dwarf novels, but I forget. Where kind of virtual reality has become so good that people just get addicted to it and want to stay in forever. And I think it is interesting because we do not have time for this today, and I might quite possibly require at least a small glass of wine to conduct the conversation. But it is kind of, it's interesting because when you think about kind of the people and technology allows us to stay in touch, but moving further and further apart. And I would have mixed feelings about that, because call me old-fashioned, I like to speak to people on the phone or go and meet them in real life and stuff like that. But I think some of these technologies run that risk of actually pushing a divide between people. And what impact does that have? And some of it, of course, could be positive, right? So if you're you talk about these kind of the robotic companions that they use for elderly folks in certain places. And that's something that's been, I would imagine, I've not read a great deal about it or in any form an expert on it. But I'd imagine that's very beneficial, whereas in other situations, you can see it causing a significant problem.
Yeah, I mean it's a mixed one, and I guess we'll have to see how that plays out. But I'm with you. I can see some good opportunities, and I love my real dog, but I wouldn't mind having a canine like from Doctor Who, to have, so my dog would have a companion, I guess, and I'd have an AI dog. Like, that'd be cool. Anyway, all right. Well, so we did find a few things to talk about from this month, but I admit
just
it was a little lighter.
Before we Go on, just before we go on, let me squeeze one wee topic that I added. Sorry, that's the second time you've put wee. Because you've mentioned Scotty in Star Trek, that's why. I added it to our notes late, so you probably didn't see it, but the idea of there's a company that's in closed beta at the moment doing prompt-based 3D game creation. And there's a couple of other companies in this space doing that. The only reason I want to bring this up, because you're a gamer, I like gaming too, it's a lot of fun. And often I've felt that my coding was going to be the problem with ever realizing a cool idea that I may have had. And the idea that you can use one of these systems to kind of literally go, wouldn't that be a cool game? Right, okay, I don't need to know the code. I don't need to know how to make the graphics pretty. I'm going to have the machine do it for me. And I'm going to my 5 buddies who we were talking about it, we're going to create an online multiplayer game, tap, 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 click, 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 boom. I don't know. I think that's awesome. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so what that brings to mind, because me tie back to the enterprise, but I love the idea.
Go on.
Well, but see, I think it's interesting because I think you're right that we end up with these composable applications, and in gaming, that's a good example. But I also and we've used this term before, but we didn't have the capabilities we have today to actually build composable, applications off the platform using AI and having it code for you and then doing the QA and all on it. So I actually think that is one of the things you're going to see. And I wrote something long ago about, hybrid cloud or, hybrid on premises cloud, public cloud, private cloud, all those things are converging. And it's not a choice anymore. It's not like, I'm just going to go into the public cloud. I'm doing all 3 of them depending on what it is I'm trying to do. And I sort of think that the fourth leg of that, and I hadn't really talked about this much, but I see it more and more, is the capability to do custom solutions. It is supportable because the platforms will support that, no code, low code development of those specific company specific applications. And so it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing that in gaming first, because as we know, a lot of stuff that happens in gaming first happens later in the rest of the world. So
yeah, 100%. I think it's really fascinating, and I am totally on board with your idea. The concept of those kind of composable applications, all I have to do is bring the right, the system knows what the components are. All I have to do is introduce the process that I want to run. And a really smart system is going to not only put it together for me, but it's going to tell me how I can make it better. I think, kind of absolutely the future. Anyway, sorry for dropping that one at the last minute, but anything to do with...
No, that's good. I appreciate that, because I did miss that one. It's exciting. Actually, I'm going to now have to go look it up and see if I can use it.
Go check it out. I will be signing up. I will be signing up for the when they launch it out in public. So I'm really curious to try it.
Absolutely. Yeah, me too. Well, so anyway, that's all the time we have today. I don't want to keep rambling on, although, always the conversations are fun. But anyway, I'm Michael Fawcett.
And I'm Tom Pringle.
Thanks for joining us for this month's AI Pulse. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining. Remember to hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform to help others find the show. For more on AI and other software research reports, briefs, and blog posts, check out arionresearch.com. If you have AI, generative AI, or business automation expertise, either as a provider or as an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arionresearch.com, and we'll see if we can get you on as a guest. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arion Research production. I'm Michael Fawcett, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.